What position groups should the Bills attack in the 2025 draft? We're going to take a look at that today on the Wandering Buffalo podcast. Get your hands on stylish t-shirts, hoodies, and more at wearbuff.com. That's WEARBUF.com. And make sure to use the promo code TWB at checkout for 20% off your first order. Stay Buffalo proud with Wear Buff.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. My name is Justin, and I am your host. And today I want to get into a little bit of where I think the Bills will / where I think they should go in the draft. And this is not going to be, player specific in the draft. The next two shows that we do before the draft, I'll get into some of the prospects I really like at the top of the draft in, different positions, still kind of cleaning that up on, who my real favorites are and who are realistic targets. But this idea kind of came up in just draft conversations that I've been having. And talking to one of my buddies, and he was talking about how the Bills have to go cornerback in the first round. Like, trade up, get aggressive, do whatever you got to do. You have to go get a cornerback in round one. And I started kind of playing with the idea of different scenarios, and this is where I like getting the mock draft simulators involved. There's so many players coming into the league. There's to do like a good mock draft, you got to kind of put in the effort of knowing or thinking what other teams might do. And all that, it's just a thought exercise. So I like playing around with them to kind of see more where depth is at what positions, where the runs happen. Kind of get an idea of what other teams, what players other teams are taking. And listen, I'm a huge fan of the Bills. I got a pretty good idea of what I think might happen there. I can't do that for all 32 teams in the league to, make the best mock drafts and, really be predictive with it. But going with the idea of the Bills have to take a cornerback at the top of the draft, it just kind of sent me spiraling on just kind of how we view the draft as fans versus how the team views it versus like what the reality is, I guess. And, the first thing that came to my mind is it's easy to do. I do it myself. As fans, it's easy to kind of get locked into that first round and to a lesser extent, like the first 3 rounds, it's where we historically see, impact players coming into teams. It's where the fun is. It's where the sexy picks are. That being said, like GMs don't plan their organizations around the first 3 rounds like we do. Especially when you have a guy like Brandon Beane who's hit on players that have become impact players on this team in the later rounds. So I was kind of wrestling with this idea that the Bills have to take a cornerback at the top of the draft. And that conversation continued to like maybe they even double dip in the first 2 rounds and take a cornerback at 30, and with the second pick maybe somebody. The name here that came up was Savon Revel, and it was like, he might miss some time in his rookie year, but you could get him a little devalued and have your cornerback room set up for the next 10 years. And I think that's a fun idea on paper. It concerns me of, I think the biggest need on this team is defensive line help, so concerns me that we're waiting that long to address it. But just kind of want to unpack the idea of cornerback early, and not just early, maybe first 2 picks. And if I'm looking at this in trying to be at least in some way predictive, I'm I might even be surprised if the Bills take cornerback in the first round. When we're looking at this idea that the Bills need to take cornerback, it's very much it's a different story for me if you didn't have Benford on the roster. If you were legitimately in a position where you had to go find CB1 that will likely be starting week 1. And the reason I see this so much differently than I think a lot of people out there may be seeing it is just over the tenure of Beane and McDermott, we haven't seen a ton of investment in cornerback early. And I know the obvious name that comes up was Kyer Elam. Yep, that one happened. I would also kind of, you know, put the caveat on that you had aging players. You probably intended for him to end up being your CB1 and maybe kind of offset, reset contracts. In this scenario, we have Christian Benford on the roster. You know, currently he's extension eligible. We haven't seen that happen yet, but assuming they get him locked up, dude is legitimately a top 10 cornerback in this league. And you're looking for the cornerback to start opposite him. And in the history of Beane and McDermott with the Bills, they haven't put a huge priority on this position. They've had a lot of success having, just insert guys, veterans, signing like vet minimums, just undrafted free agents. They've had a ton of success without really investing in the cornerback 2 position. And that's not to say that I think Dane Jackson is going to be the week 1 starter because they added him. I'm also not saying that Dane Jackson won't be the week 1 starter. I wouldn't be all that surprised. But when we look at the CB2 position since Beane has come to the Bills, you think about guys like we had Phillip Gaines, EJ Gaines, Josh Norman, Dane Jackson, Levi Wallace. Keep the list going. Kevin Seymour. There's been all kinds of dudes that have come in to this CB2 spot and played adequately, and they've been frustrating at times. But for the production that they've been able to get out of these players with very little investment made there, it's just kind of the blueprint of what they've done. Now, does that mean that they can't change and go into this draft and be like, you know what? We want to go get a dude. We're going to lock up Benford, get him like a 4-year deal. We're going to have this guy on a rookie contract, cost controlled 4 years, and we're just going to have 2 dudes out there. And to a further extent, maybe even the double dip of taking a guy in the first and the second and increase your chances of finding a dude and not having to worry about that for 5 years. Things change. We've seen the Bills defense be pretty much the weak link when the Bills, end up making their playoff exit. So maybe it is a situation where they do something like that and they want to double dip and just not have to worry about that for 5 years. For my opinion, I just don't see that as the case. And like I said at the top of the show, I would be even a little bit shocked to even see them take cornerback in the first round. I just think that how much we hear McDermott and Beane talk about the game still being won in the trenches and, their postseason pressers talking about not having gotten enough from the D line and needing much more there. And when I think about the playoff losses, yes, there's some coverage on the back end that comes up. And obviously, the one fresh in our minds is against the Chiefs. Kyrie Elam struggling to stay on his feet. Like, yeah, that was a coverage game. But what has happened more than that, in my opinion, is we get to the playoffs and we're facing these elite quarterbacks. And I think about games against Mahomes and Burrow and just the games that we're not able to get after the quarterback at all. And, you can play zone, you can play man. You give Mahomes time to throw, he's going to find somebody open. It's the same way that we talk about Allen for the Chiefs. Like, if you want to argue if he's number one, number two, number three, whatever, a top three quarterback in the league, and you have to be able to get after them. And what did we see in the Super Bowl with the Eagles? They're able to roll all of these defensive linemen out there. They're staying fresh. They're collapsing the pocket. And, all of a sudden you get pressure in your face. And it doesn't really matter how good Patrick Mahomes is at throwing the ball if he's got no time to get it out. And just kind of fresh off of our loss to the Chiefs, watching what the Eagles were able to do to them, hearing the messaging from Beane and McDermott at the end of the season, I would just be absolutely shocked to see them do something different than defensive line in the first round. And, the counter to this I've heard is, it's a super deep defensive tackle draft, and the corners are going to go fast, and you could wait, and you might be able to get, that style defensive tackle in rounds 3 or 4 or something like that. And I just feel like this has been a position that every year Beane has been investing in and trying to get right. And, mixed results. Some years it's a little bit better than others. But for how many assets that have gone into this room, it's still not where you'd think they want it to be. And what they're really missing from that group is, some first round talent. Yeah, Ed Oliver's there. That was, a pick very early in their tenure. And, looking at some of the other investments that have been made there. Groot, you know, I love Groot. He's been a great player for the Bills. I'm glad he's extended. You have, Bosa in the mix now. But then you kind of look at the rest of the defensive line. There was pick spent on Epinesa and Boogie Basham. Boogie's not even with the team anymore. Epinesa, I like as a rotation guy, but is that the impact that you were looking for from a second round pick? We look at all of the free agent additions that we've made over the years. Thinking Star, Quentin Jefferson. Boy, there's so many names there of just people that we've brought in to try to get that room right. And for how many assets have been put into the defensive line room versus other units, you'd think that would conceivably be a strength of the team right now. And it's really still not there. And looking at what we have right now, there's still a ton of room to grow that room. And you look at defensive end, Joey Bosa's on a 1-year deal. From my understanding, there's some void years on there, and it can be converted, and it can be a longer-term contract depending on how the season goes. But as of right now, it's a 1-year deal. Epinesa's contract is up after this year. You have Javon Solomon in the room. We haven't really seen anything from him yet. Dwayne Carter and Ed Oliver are your two defensive tackles that are under contract beyond the season. Dwayne Carter flashed in moments last year, but did he give you, anything solid to plan on him being a long-term answer that's not more than just like hope for development, which is great. I love doing that. If you if you listen to the show, you know how much I love the preseason. I love seeing these depth players get the extra work, all that. We've heard it from so many shows. You've heard it on this show. Hope cannot be your plan. When you're in a legitimate Super Bowl window, you have to attack the biggest weaknesses on the roster. And for me right now, that's defensive tackle, it's defensive line. So I would be much more inclined if we're going from a predictive a predictive perspective. I would venture to think that defensive tackle would be the first round target, and to a greater extent, I would say that I don't expect the Bills to stay put at 30. I think it's going to go one of two ways. The defensive tackles they're looking at are thinning out, and they use some of their assets to get up higher in round one. Or there's a lot more sitting on the board, and they're comfortable with several guys, and they trade back. And I see trade back as less likely. I don't think it's the move that I would want to do this year because they've gathered so many assets. They have 21 picks over the next 2 seasons. That's not counting, any comp picks that we might end up getting next year. So at a certain point, you've built this core of players. You've let a lot of the aging players go. You have a nice youngish core going on here, and you were on the doorstep of a Super Bowl berth last year. So realistically, just seeing all those assets, like you gather all that, in my opinion, to have the flexibility to move up in the draft. And this is kind of the time period where I would love for Beane to get aggressive and go after a dude that you really think is going to be like a monumental difference for this team. And I know all the adage and cliches are out there that you're never one player away, blah blah blah. I get that. But I think with all the assets that you have to work with right now, you have to get aggressive and you have to bring in a guy that's an impact, a big difference maker on defense. And, like I said, we'll get into more of the names that I'm looking at for next week. But when I look at the cornerback room, I think your impact, your difference maker at that level is Christian Benford. Now, am I opposed to having another one opposite him? No. But when I look at who is our difference maker across the defensive line, I don't really have an impact game-wrecking guy there. I think we've seen Ed Oliver have the potential to do it and the flashes. I think a lot of us will agree at this point that Ed Oliver is a very good player that thrives when he has another good player next to him. Thinking back to the early days of Star, thinking back to when Daquan Jones was playing at a very high level and how much better Ed Oliver was there. Like, taking the draft capital out of it, yeah, Ed Oliver was a top 10 pick. And when you look through that draft, there's maybe some other guys that went after him that ended up having better careers to this point. That's fine. Obviously, it's really easy in hindsight. There's things that maybe we could have or would have done differently. But you have the guy here, and it's not like he's this complete bust that you have to get rid of. We've seen him play at a very high level. If he needs somebody else playing at a high level next to him, go get the highest level guy to play next to him and have Ed Oliver be your second best defensive tackle. That's the way I look at this. get a real game wrecker up the middle that can collapse the pocket and get pressure right in the face. Or get yourself that two gapper that's going to eat up space and free up Ed Oliver to work one-on-one, free up your linebackers. That could be a solution too. It doesn't have to be a guy that's, just getting sacks. And when I continue looking at the defensive line for impact players, for guys that can wreck a game and really tilt the odds in your favor, we have Groot. I mean, I think Groot is awesome. I think he's kind of in a similar vein to Ed Oliver that like almost like a 1B type of player that will just thrive with somebody else on the other end of them. And maybe that is Bosa. Bosa is certainly the player across this defensive line with the pedigree, with the proven success, the awards, the accolations, all that. He's the guy on the defensive line right now that could be the game wrecker. There's so much unknown there. Can we get him healthy for a season? What does his role look like? How many snaps is he going to play? What does it look like beyond this year? So I think you not only need to be thinking about defensive tackle, I think you need to be thinking edge too. For me, the defensive line is probably your first two picks, and then we address cornerback from there. And like I said, there's been so many different iterations of this defense with, like a plug and play vet that you bring in that, establishes a floor for you. And, you don't have much ceilings to look forward to. And when I think about this, our guy from last year, Rasul Douglas, is still on the market. And I don't know if this is, the Bills not being very eager to re-sign him. I don't know if it's, the Bills made an offer that's lower dollars than he wants, and he's kind of testing the waters, and we'll circle back to it. Maybe it's the Bills having, communication with them, being like, hey, if we don't get this guy we want, you're coming back. There's all kinds of things that we're not privy to. But would you be surprised if, the draft comes and goes, you see the Bills signed Rasul Douglas and, drafted a cornerback in, say, they used their assets to get a guy in the third and they brought in a second guy in the fifth. And they added Rasul Douglas, and you're going to camp with Rasul Douglas, Dane Jackson, your two rookies, Jamarcus Ingram to Corey Couch, Jamarcus Ingram, and that's your camp battles. And whoever wins it, and then you have some depth. It's not the sexiest version of this playing out, and I don't need to be right here. It could be a combination of, like defensive tackle round one, then your cornerback, then edge. You have the 2 second-round picks. You have the ability to use some of those other picks to get back up into the top 100. There's all different ways that this could play out. But for how much I think they can invest into the defensive line room and have that be a guy or an area where you lock in guys that you don't have to worry about for 5 years. Talking at the top of the show about could they do that with the cornerback room? I just see it much more likely that if that's kind of the plan in place, obviously this is kind of a macro view of it. There's going to be another draft next year. There's going to be another free agency next year, all that. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of where can we add guys that hopefully we solidify that room for 4 or 5 years, and the next time we have to worry about it is when we decide what contracts we can give out. Do you see it as more likely to be done in the defensive line, the edge group, Brandon Beane, Sean McDermott talking about winning games in the trenches? Or do you see that level of investment happening in the cornerback room, where you have a starting quarter CB1 already on the roster, where you've seen them for 7 years now, platoon and stopgap guys and veteran additions. We'll see. This is why we got to wait for the draft and see how it all shakes out. Predictively, I think there's a much better chance that we see defensive line, defensive tackle, edge be the top priorities. And I think there's a good chance that there will be far less emphasis placed on the cornerback room than a lot of us think there might be. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. Like I said, the remaining episodes leading up to the draft, we're going to dive into some prospects that I really like. It'll be more towards the top of the draft, first 2-3 rounds. We're going to start out with defensive tackle and edge next week. Have some guys for you. Then we'll look at the cornerback. But I do thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the show. Do appreciate if you like, share, subscribe, tell a friend about the show, drop a comment. Let me know what you think the Bills are going to do. Make sure you're checking out the website. We have some prospect profiles written up. A lot of the guys that I'm going to talk about on this show, we have some articles written by myself, Jake, our guys that just joined the team, Mike and Don. So make sure you're checking out the website, wanderingbuff.com. We got some merch up there, some clothes, all the good stuff. Follow us on all the social medias. It's greatly appreciated. We will see you next week. Until then, and as always, go Bills.